Well, this is a continuation about Danish nouns, which is probably the hardest part of the Danish language. It's also probably the most important part of learning any language is really how to use nouns, which are just words for things, using them in a sentence and using them in these grammatical structures. And in Danish, that is probably the hardest part of the entire language. So I'm going to be starting out with that. It's a steep learning curve for anyone looking to learn Danish to have to go through the nouns because the adjectives and the verbs aren't nearly as hard as the nouns. But yeah, this is like the second part where I'm going to talk about the plural form of nouns, and I recommend that you watch the first video I did about nouns, which is the Danish class 1 video, because I'm going to be using some of the concepts that I used in that video in this one as well, and you won't understand them if you haven't watched the first one. So the thing about the Danish noun plural is that it has its own dynamic element to it. We talked in the last video about how we use genders when we use nouns. All nouns have a gender, and 75% of nouns belong to one of the two genders. This is also kind of the case here, as we have different ways of making the plural form with Danish nouns. In English, you pretty much just add an S, an ES, or an IES, depending on the ending. There are some irregular ones, but in English, it's basically just adding the S, you can say, as a general rule. While in Danish, we have multiple ways of making the plural, which is pretty frustrating for anyone trying to learn it, because it is kind of random. At the same time, it has the easier element to it that the plural in Danish doesn't care about gender. So whenever you're talking about something in plural, you don't have to worry about which gender the word is, which is something pretty good. And also, the logical structures, the grammatical structures used when using singular nouns also count when using the plural nouns. And two of the adjective forms that we have also aren't really relevant here. They're only relevant for the singular noun. So some parts of using the plural are more easy and some parts are more hard. The hard part of it is basically generating it, because there are different ways of making the plural. Yeah, I'm going to go through that here. So we have 4 different types of plurals, and some of them are more common than others. You'll see the first one is the ER ending. I have E in parentheses here because if the word already ends in E, then we just have to add the R, which is a pretty common pattern that we've already seen in the last video. Now this one luckily accounts for about 75% of all nouns. 75% of all Danish nouns have this plural ending if you put it in plural, which means that if you don't know which one it is, which you probably don't if you don't learn all of them by heart, then you're just going to guess for this one. This one is a pretty safe bet for any noun, yeah. We have a second one, which is the E ending, where it just ends in E. And this one is about 15% of the vocabulary, which leaves us with the last 10%. Now, about 10% of Danish nouns, and I almost believe it's maybe a little bit less than that, but anyway, the grammar book says 10, so I'm going to go with that. About 10% of them have no plural. It happens in English too, that you have words like one fish or two fish, like words that don't have a plural, while the singular and the plural is the same, and this happens quite commonly in Danish as well. So that's about 10% of them. Now the fourth one, usually you don't mention a fourth one when talking about the Danish plural, but I'm going to do it anyway because we have some of them that are irregular. It happens in English too. The irregular ones are basically words, in English for example, like one man, two men, one child, two children. You have some words where the plural is completely different from what you'd expect, which there are reasons for, I suppose. And that happens in Danish too. Now luckily, between Danish and English, a lot of the words that don't have a plural also don't have a plural in Danish, and a lot of the ones that are irregular are also irregular in Danish. So that kind of helps, you know, you can kind of predict it if you know English. Now I'm going to go through some examples of using these endings. So the first word, first I'm going to go through the ER ending, which is the most common one, probably the most important one to talk about. So we have a word, for example, en avis, a newspaper. This means a newspaper. Now in order to make the plural, I'm just going to add the ER to the end of the word, which is going to be aviser. Aviser means newspapers, like in the plural form. Another word we could go for, et værelse. Et værelse. I know it's kind of a weird pronunciation of that word, but that is how you say it. Et værelse. Værelse. Et værelse means a room, like a room in a house, yeah, and that is going to be in plural værelser, værelser. Now I'm not gonna add the ER completely because it already ends in E, so I only have to add the R. I don't have to add one extra E here, so it's valser, yeah. Another example, we have et æble, a word that we used in the former video. It's gonna mean an apple, yeah. And the plural form of that is æbler. Again, it already ends in E, so I just have to add the R here. Æbler means apples. Okay, the last example for this one would be en uge, another word that we saw in the last video. En uge means a week, and that's going to become uger, uger. It ends in ER here. It already ends in E, so I just have to add the R again. Great, so that's the first one. Now for using the second plural, the E plural, I have some more examples here. We have it hus, also a word from the other video. It means a house, and it becomes then huse, huse. I just add the E to the end, yeah, huse. We have another one which is it len. The D is silent. D's are usually silent after N's, yeah. It len, which means a country, a country. So that will become lande. The D stays silent. Lande. I just add the E to the end. One more example. In hund. In hund means a dog, and that's going to become hunde. Also just adding the E with the silent D as well here. This is the same rule. Then we have in lærer. In lærer. And this one's a little bit special. In lærer means a teacher. The reason why it's special is because it already ends in ER. It already has that kind of vocal ending. Lærer, lærer, lærer. I don't really pronounce the R. It's not like a guttural R where I say or something like that, like they would do in a language like French. It's really soft actually. It's just in lærer. Now, when I want to do the plural here, adding the E, it's not going to sound like you might expect it to, because I'm not going to say lærer or anything like that. I'm not really going to pronounce it. Whenever you have this ending, which is the R-E-R-E, or something like that, where you have this repetition, it just makes the vocal longer. So this is actually pronounced lærer, lærer. It gets really long. So the first one, in lærer, it's kind of fast like that. This one, lærer. I just extend the last vocal on this one instead of actually pronouncing the consonants. This is done in all words that end like this in R-E-R or something like that when you add like the plural form to it. It just becomes long. A little bit hard to kind of grasp because it doesn't read like that at all. But anyway, there are gonna be more examples of that later. Then we have the third form, which is the no plural form. So that would, for example, be en fisk. You might guess it. It means a fish. And then you have fisk, meaning fish. You know, it's the plural of fish. So this is the same thing. Then we have one, for example, it flay. It flay, also kind of easy to guess here. It means a flag. So I'm gonna put that a flag, and it also just becomes flay. Yeah, it's the same thing. Maybe one more example. It all. It all means a year. A year. And so that in plural is also all. You know, it's really like the same thing. So whenever you have to say how old you are, you actually use the word year in the plural form, or if you are talking about someone who's only 1 year old, then it's the same word, you know. All right. So I'm gonna be going here through some irregular plurals. So some of the irregular ones would be a word like in men, which we talked about earlier. In men, a man, yeah. A man becomes men, men, which actually sounds exactly like men in English. We just have a different vocal in this case. One more would be et barn, which means a child, which in English is also irregular, children. Now in this case it will become børn. We also just change the vocal here. Børn means children. Alright, let's go for en ko, meaning a cow, becomes køer. So here we can see some different patterns because some nouns in Danish have irregular plurals that don't really make any sense. There are some lists of some vocals changing into other vocals, as we can see here, for example, and some patterns that can be observed with the irregular plurals, but there are so few of them that I'm not really going to go through it. I think that's just going to break your head more than anything, really. Now, in order to kind of predict which one to use, which plural ending to use, there are some general rules, some rules of thumb for which words or which word structures have well, which plural ending. Now there's a long list of these, and I think some of the most common ones, for example, are pretty much all words ending in a vowel. Yeah, like pretty much all words ending in a vowel have the er ending to them. There are some exceptions, of course, but like the majority of all nouns ending in vowels have this one. So we could have some example. For example, krone, meaning crown, becomes kroner. Yeah, that's also the currency of Denmark, by the way. Crowns, yeah, kroner. We have lampe, meaning lamp, becomes lamper. We have, for example, menneske, meaning human, becoming mennesker. You have, for example, vindu, meaning window, becoming vinduer. Yeah. So we can just see this kind of pattern whenever nouns end in vowels. Now on the other side, nouns that only have one syllable in them and end with a consonant, they usually have the e ending, which is the second most popular one. So you could, for example, have a word like del, which means part. It becomes dele, adds an e to the end, yeah. Then, for example, you have dreng, meaning boy. It becomes drenge. Then you also have stol, meaning chair or stool, however you like, becoming stole. Yeah. So I'm just gonna put that up here as well, which are monosyllabic nouns ending in consonant. They usually have the e ending here. All right. And now to kind of go back to this example that we have had before about a teacher in lærer, and that kind of weird construction of the plural with the weird pronunciation where we just stretch the vocal, like the last vocal of the word. This kind of construction really counts for all occupations, some nationalities, all of these nouns that end in er, their plural ends in e. So I'm gonna put that here, e when it ends in er, yeah. So some examples of that could, for example, be arbejder, which means a worker. That plural would be arbejder, arbejder. Notice that I just stretched the last vocal of the word in that one. We have another one, kunstner, meaning artist. Kunst means art, yeah, so kunstner is an artist. Well, that would be kunstner. I also stretched the vocal on that one. We have, for example, dansker, meaning Dane. Not Danish, but Dane. That would be dansker, also stretching the last vocal on this one. So these are also some pretty common patterns on how you can predict which plural that you're going to use with which noun. There's a much longer list in the grammar book that I mentioned in the last video, but I think if you really try to memorize all of them, you're just going to be over-analyzing every sentence. So the best bet is probably just to guess for one of them and really just guess for the most likely one, or whatever you feel that you might have heard before or something like that. So you have to kind of learn them by heart in this sense. So there's one more thing I kind of want to touch on, which is doubling of the final consonant. In Danish, whenever the last syllable of the word, and it can be a one-syllable word, whenever the last syllable of the word is stressed and it ends in a consonant, whenever we do the plural, it duplicates the consonant. There are some reasons for doing this, kind of translating into pronunciation. Whenever you have two of the same letter repeating, then you know that it's going to be pronounced a bit faster. I'm not going to talk so much about that here. I just kind of want to touch on it so that you don't get confused when you see it, because I think some of my examples actually have it in them, and you might ask yourself, why does the spelling change? Well, that's because we're making it into a plural word. So we have just some examples of that. In bus, which is a bus, it becomes busser. Yeah. In boutique, a boutique, a store, becomes butikker. In cat, meaning a cat, becomes katte. In hat, meaning a hat, becomes hatte. So you can just see on all of these examples that the last consonant in the word becomes repeated whenever it's made into the plural form. Yeah? One more thing I also just want to say about English loanwords. We have some English words that we use in Danish quite a lot, and they actually retain their English plural ending. That could be, for example, a word like joke, joke just becomes jokes. A fan becomes fans. Check becomes checks. Yeah, so that stays the same. Whenever you have a word that's very obviously English, that's just taken from English, that retain its original pronunciation, then the plural form of that word also stays the same as the English plural. Yeah. All right. So now I'm going to talk about how to use these in sentences. Now, as I said earlier, the grammatical structures that we talked about in the last video with singular nouns actually counts here as well. As in, when you use it with definite articles, then you add the definite part onto the end of the word. Whenever you use them with adjectives, there are also some things that you have to think about when you use them. When you use defined nouns with adjectives, there are some different structures for that. Now, these are the same with the plural, except that the way that you generate them is a little bit different, but the same rules still count for the constructions. Yeah. So if we're going to be talking about using defined plural nouns, yeah, if we have a defined singular noun, we add the article to the back of the noun. So, for example, en man becomes mannen, which means the man. Yeah, we just add the article to the end of the noun. And in this case, it's important to think about the gender, because, I mean, it could be an it gender word. It whose, for example, would become huset, adding the et to the end. Now, with the plural, we don't have to think about that. However, we do have to think about the plural form, about which one of these four it might be. Well, actually, just the first three. Now, what are the rules for this? We have the first one, which is the er ending. Now, that one looks like this. We add erne. The second one is the e ending, where we add ene. And the third one, when there's no plural, also adds ene, which makes it a little bit easier. So we only have two to worry about, really, in this sense. Now, what does this mean? Whenever we have a plural, when constructed as a plural, ends with er, or just an r if it already ends in e, then to use the word the, to make it defined, we have to add erne to the stem. If the plural is an e plural, or if there's no plural at all, then to make it defined plural, then we add ene. So we're going to go through some examples of that, obviously. So, for example, we have the words that end in er. So we're going to make those defined. Let's say, in avis, right, is a newspaper. We can agree on that. And so avisen would be the newspaper. Now, how would we say multiple newspapers if it ends in er? Then we just add it to the end, yeah? Aviser, newspapers. And then to say the newspapers, we have to add erne. So it will become aviserne. We add erne to the end of the word, yeah? There we go. The newspapers. All right, we have some more examples. Did I pull that way down? Yeah, I pulled that way down. Okay, I'm gonna add it up here. We have another example. It æble, right, is an apple. Æblet is the apple. Æbler, ending in er, is apples, and æblerne would be the apples, yeah, in defined plural. So this is kind of the pattern that we're going for here. Now, on the words that have the e plural, the 15% of all those nouns, the nouns that have the e plural, add the ene ending. So I'm going to go through some examples of that as well. We have it hus, right, meaning a house. That will become then, in defined, huset, the house. Then in plural, in just undefined plural, it will become huse, which means houses. And in defined plural, it would be husene, adding this ene ending to it, yeah, which would be the houses. Pretty difficult, yeah, pretty difficult to follow the structure every time that you use a noun. You always have to think about whether you're defining it or you're not defining it, whether it's in singular or it's in plural. But here we can see some kind of table of how that works. Another example, it land, right, means a country. How would you say the country? You would say landet. Landet becomes the country. Countries in plural would be lande, adding the E. It's an E ending. So countries. And then the countries, landene. Sounds kind of funny. Landene. I'm repeating that. So the countries. Here we are. Now I'm also going to be doing some examples with the no plural. It actually follows the same rule, really. I mean, you have in fisk, right, which means a fish. Then you have the fish, which would be fisken, the fish. And then to do the plural, well, there's no plural at all, so it's just fisk, fish. It's the same in Danish and English, really. There's no plural for it. But when we say the fish in plural, then we say fiskene. Add the ene to the end of it. The fish, plural. You can see that in English they actually don't distinguish between these, but in Danish the plural is distinguished. Another example, we could take et flag, yeah, which is a flag. Then flail is the flag. Flag, again, there's no plural, so it's just flags. And then we have flagene, ending in ene, becomes the flags. Alright, not sure I'm gonna go through all the examples because I think this is becoming a long video already anyway. Now, last, I'm just going to talk about how to use the adjectives with them. If you've already watched the first video, it's actually really easy to understand because the system is the same. You know, the thing we have to consider is which adjective form to use. And we actually only have one adjective form to use whenever we use it with plurals, because the E adjective form is the plural adjective form. Now we use it as well when we define, when we use defined singular nouns with adjectives, but it is technically the plural form of the adjective is adding E to the end of the adjective, as I talked about in the last video. So if we're going to use the same adjective as we used in the last video, which is stor, meaning big, well, in that case we just have to add E to the end of it to use it with an adjective to make sure that it has coherence. Yeah. So let's say big fish, right? Store fisk, easy. How about big newspapers? Store aviser. How about big apples? Store æbler. It's really that simple, yeah. You don't have to think about the gender of the word or anything, which is one of the easy parts of using the plural. It doesn't really matter, neither with the adjective, neither with the ending, which makes a noun plural. It doesn't matter which gender the noun is. You just kind of have to make it using this other system. So that it's one more thing to think about, but at least they don't kind of blend together. Now, whenever you use defined plural nouns with adjectives, it also follows the defined nouns with adjectives structure that we talked about the last one, which is, for example, den store mand, den gode hue, and so on, where you have to use the word that, den or det, with the adjective and then with the noun. Now, when using it in plural, you don't have to think about the gender. Again, you just use the word de. It's pronounced D. I know it's an E, but it's pronounced D. D means the in plural. So it will become de store fisk, meaning the big fish. It would be de store aviser, meaning the big newspapers, and so forth. Yeah, it's the same structure as last time, just we use this different word. So that's about it. I hope you practice it, I hope you learn it, because this is super difficult for anyone to get into, but good luck.